Hear me very clearly?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So in pondering what to talk about for this webinar, I went through a few sort of iterations. And I think something that could maybe cut across in a global sense would be, how do we improve as writers? And I'm also particularly interested of late in the writer's voice. By that, I mean that which makes a writer stand out, or at least have others be able to identify him or her by virtue of the stylistics, maybe the content, and so on. So I thought maybe I could combine the two topics which are enfolded and related, and just chat about them to you today. It's going to be, I mean, it's a structured talk, but the way I teach and I talk about the subject is in a kind of, not quite free consciousness sort of rollout, but I do like to sort of synthesize ideas, even as they present themselves to me, sometimes at the most awkward or inopportune moments. So yes, what you see there on the screen is what I've sort of the skeletal breakdown of what it is that I want to talk to you about today. And I believe that the craft of writing can be broken down into three interrelated areas. So those areas will tell us what we can concentrate on, how we can create kind of a priority for certain things over others, and so on and so forth. So let me start by running through that and see what comes out of it. Okay, so what I mean by concentrating or inquiring about the ethos and spirit of the times. Okay, so every epoch in the world, in every grouping, I believe has a kind of spirit that runs over it. And I don't necessarily mean a kind of, embodied spirit, although it does present itself, it does embody itself in the works of the writers. But it's an ethos. It's something that emerges and is localized too. For example, the Industrial Revolution brought about a certain kind of scientific ethos, which affected certain sort of approaches to writing. It permeated the sociological content of writing. We understood more about the mechanistic aspect, or some people thought so, of psychology, certain things having cause and effect, and the physiological also, that which can be seen and touched. Every epoch has a spirit or an ethos that influences almost every other aspect. And since writing, art in general, reflects humanity, so must, and things change or advance, at least that is one of the narratives, so then must the art that humanity writes. So we have certain things that, in my opinion, sort of occurred, let's say, with the postmodernists, where certain things arose which caused confusion. So in the 60s and 70s, 80s, there was a sense that there is no meaning, there is no truth, everything is contextualized, meaning can be sort of incorporated by looking at the wider context where something appears. And obviously that was reflected in works like Sartre's Nausea and so on. So we have that kind of movement, and it depends where you look, at which part of the world you're looking at. But in the West, that is more or less what was happening. Now, opposed to that, we have the sense that certain things don't change. For example, morals oughtn't to change. They should remain universally true. They're not subject to a ticking clock. That's one of the interesting things about the classics. And I'm talking here now primarily sort of in Western culture, but we have that very much in the Asian cultures, where we have a sense that reality is somehow something that doesn't change, and what changes is the projection that plays within it. So in the classics, there was a sense that the heavens, although I wouldn't say the Greek gods were really models for human sort of decency, but the heavens had reached a sort of perfection. And because perfection means that which cannot change, if something is perfect and it changes, it almost by definition becomes imperfect. So in a sense, in the classics, there was a sense that once you've reached a certain level, Plato's forms, you've understood that kind of superlative and transcendent truth, that couldn't change. So the clock, in a sense, had stopped ticking for that transcendent layer. And it's much the same in some of the other cultures that still believe in tradition, honor tradition, and so on. And that's why I talk about humanity's trajectory in incorporating the new, but in honoring the old, seeing what is good about the journey, the human journey that can persist and can inform the new. Without ending up in the death trap, I believe, of postmodernist, let's say, literature, where we just make stuff up as we go along and there is no truth. You see, I think in that sense, I think what has happened there is the connotation. So we have denotation and connotation in a word. This is a chair. This is a table. And those words denote the function of the table and the chair. Connotation, though, is, well, a chair is something to sit on if you're tired and you need to, or a table is somewhere perhaps where one can assemble and have dinner and socialize and so on. And what's happening in today's culture, I think connotation is actually usurping denotation. It is flooding through the denotative meaning. We're saying, well, there's no real meaning to things. So today's connotation, or this decade's connotation, is this is true. And that meaning is relative. So I think it's important to, when one is looking at that aspect of growth. So what does a writer do? Well, a writer should be studying every culture, insofar as it's possible, and the history, the philosophers of the culture, the great literary giants of that culture, and comparing it to today's shifts and seeing, is there something that can be continued? Is there something that can be preserved? Because there is a war going on in the West nowadays about the most fundamental definitions of what constitutes categories. And once you destroy categories, then anything goes. So it is important to look to the past, both in terms of literature and philosophy and science, and see how far we've come, what have we gotten wrong, and how can we stabilize some of the things that are going on in the West. And I'm particularly talking about sort of Western earthquakes, so to speak, that are occurring. So how do we improve as writers? Well, we study the past and we compare it to today, and we project into the future. And certain genres will allow us to do that better than others. Science fiction will allow us to project things into the future. That is one huge area, I think, where writers can improve their craft. But that is something that takes a long time. It takes maturity to grow with those ideas. I mean, if I were to say, okay, the work of Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, synthesized the works of Hume. He looked at Descartes as well, and Leibniz. and sort of came up with a stunning, for the 1800s, a stunning realization that perception and rationality are needed to create knowledge. Whereas Hume thought, no, it's just what all knowledge comes through the senses, and Leibniz says, no, it's all rational. So, and Kant proved through logic that no, you actually need both. Sense perceptions can only be synthesized by almost like the ROM in a computer. Information comes in, but it needs to be organized in certain ways in order to make sense of it. So that happened by his reading, looking into the past and coming up with something for his present. So being aware of the great movements, the great traditions of our past is absolutely inevitable for growing as a writer. But that takes time. And I think the guiding principle when we critique modern movements with the knowledge of the old is that we bring compassion into our critiques, okay? At every age, everybody thinks they've got it solved, okay? Until the next age proves us wrong, at least in the sciences. But arguments can be made that morality, those things don't change. Is that true? Well, you should be able to have a debate about that. How will you have that debate? By looking at the past and the present and perhaps thinking about, speculating about the future. So I think some respect and compassion and acknowledging the value of the old in the new is called for. So that would bring the first sort of container where I would put in my little bits of knowledge. I almost want to think of it as having 3 buckets. And as you sort of journey through life, you put stuff in relation to the craft of writing or art in general. You would put stuff in one basket and then revisit it. It's a way of categorizing knowledge. But just know that obviously that is, it's on a slow, the railway is slow moving there because it takes maturity to be able to synthesize the thinking of the past. Plus you have to have a historical context, because how do you know? How can you stitch ideas together from the past to the present if you don't have a historical understanding of what has gone before, what problems people will face? So being well read about one's history of thought is, I think, absolutely essential. Then, of course, this is a bit easier in a way, to actually study, master, practice the nuts and bolts of storytelling. Okay. These are the mechanics, okay? Aristotle told us many, many, many years ago that a story has a beginning, middle, and end. So that we have known for centuries, and all stories have, all good stories, in my opinion, have a beginning, middle, and end. By the way, my PhD was on multiform and multi-strand narrative structures, which means that we discombobulate that kind of narrative structure that is taken for granted when we write a story, that will have a beginning, will have an end. So, so there is something to be said about discombobulating that structure, but for the vast majority of stories that we all enjoy, and stories that we want to derive meaning from, have this beginning, middle, and end. And the end is a very important thing. The Greeks call it the telos, the end, to which all things are aimed. It's like an arrow. You have to have the end point to aim the arrow in that direction if you are to hopefully hit the bull's eye. So what goes into the second basket of the nuts and bolts? Okay, well, obviously knowing about a beginning, middle, and end in a story. And then people came after that and took this Aristotelian sort of guidance. He talked about other things, about unity of the drama and so on and so forth, and they expanded it. People in the writing in English, of course, and primarily in film, but that stands on a par with creative writing, novels and novellas and so on, to be able to, and they expanded it. They expanded it. We came up with story beats. So Christopher Vogler wrote The Writer's Journey, and he based that on the work of Joseph Campbell and Carl Gustav Jung, where a story is a journey that the hero undertakes to achieve an outward goal. But simultaneously, in order to achieve this goal, the hero has to undertake an inner journey, and what we call the character arc. So in order to get the golden apples at the end of the journey, in Hades, Hercules has to learn sort of a few lessons about his own weaknesses and so on, and depends which myth you're looking at. In some of them, he's more engages in debauchery more than in others. So a hero's journey is actually a journey to self-realization. And in the works of Jung, we talk about the archetypes, and Christopher Vogler sort of uses and expands and simplifies Campbell's archetypes, the hero, the mentor, the herald. I have all of these videos up, by the way, 4 5-minute videos on my website, Get Writing. It's on YouTube. And I look at all of these in turn. But all these archetypes, of which Christopher Vogler identifies 8, but you can come up with several more and group them in different ways, all of those are seen as characters in a story. Now, this is what I mean by the nuts and bolts. We have to know about Christopher Vogler's method. We have to know about Sid Field's method, who was one of the earlier so-called gurus of story structure. And we have Robert McKee's story. Yes, Regina? Somebody's put up a hand. Okay. So where was I? So those are nuts and bolts. We have, so in Christopher Vogler's model of the hero's journey, it's in his book, The Writer's Journey, actually, because the writer also undertakes the journey with the hero. We have 12 beats: introduction to the ordinary world, the coming of the herald, who gives the challenge, the outer challenge, the meeting with a mentor, the refusal of the call, because the hero initially doesn't want to take the call, meeting with a mentor to help him change his mind, crossing over the first threshold, and so on. So these are all story beats. So we have to know about these different sorts of systems if we are to write. In fact, The Land Below, I used Blake Schneider's Save the Cat. Blake Schneider wrote a book called Save the Cat that has 15 story beats. And each beat demarcates a growth of the hero through life's hard knocks towards achieving his goal, which is dual, by the way. It's to achieve the physical story goal, and it is also, it can only be achieved actually through some sort of self-actualization. And just jumping back, it's very close to the Jungian model. Just to jump very, very briefly back to the Jungian and Vogler idea, is that all these archetypes, all these figures that appear at certain points, at certain beats in the story, can also be seen as, there's 8 of them, comprise the character, the personality, the psyche. There are psychic fragments. The shadow is a psychic fragment. The herald is a psychic fragment. The hero is within one character. So the way we study a kind of encapsulated psychology is by taking those out of an individual and projecting them into the realm of a story and having them fight it out and have a relationship between each other. But what the story is telling us is we are trying to find a way to integrate these energies within us. Sometimes we're a hero, sometimes we're a villain, sometimes we're wise, sometimes we shapeshift. These are all archetypes. So It's a very rich system in that it plays out a story, but it also reflects the kind of psychology in every human through archetypes. Well, that comes under nuts and bolts. We should know about this, even if we're not going to use this model. Sid Field has got a much simpler model, having come first before Vogler and so on, whereby he has just the introduction, the hero before the change, the inciting incident, an event happens which incites the story, turning point, he's got a pinch, he's got a midpoint, he's got a second pinch, he's got a second turning point, he's got a climax and a resolution. Whether we use that model, well, we have to know about them. So the nuts and bolts are the practicalities of how to actually write a story, the techniques embedded in turning points and other structures. In the most recent video that went up on Saturday on YouTube, I talk about the difference between a twist and a turning point. Do we even know what the difference is? Well, yeah, so those are the nuts and bolts. The genre helps to shape a story, because in a genre, certain expectations are promised to the viewer or audience or the reading public, the public reading your novel. So a genre has certain expectations, but genre can't keep repeating the same expectations. It has to undergo some sort of mild and beneficial genetic mutation, because otherwise it gets stuck. So what happens is you have a Western where all the bad guys wear black hats. Let's say I'm being facetious now, but they wear black hats. And then somebody, through some accident or intent, has a bad guy wear a white hat. And if the movie or the book does well, then the people following say, oh, maybe we can use this ambiguity of a bad guy wearing a white hat. And that gets absorbed into the genre. So genre is not static. Well, we have to know about that, because that is part of the nuts and bolts of storytelling. Okay. So, and to me, the most important thing, and that I think is more difficult to pin down under structure, but it is the most important. What is the moral message or the theme of a story? Okay, because your ending will, in the words of Lagos Egri, prove the theme. So themes can come in various ways. They can, and again, I've put up a video on that, I think it was last week, where we can have it in a binary form. So in Dead Poets Society, creativity versus conformity. Okay, those are the two polarities of what the moral world or what the thematic world is looking like in the story. Well, the way that you prove the theme is you have certain characters identify with conformity in this example, and certain characters identify with creativity. And then you let them loose, and then you have a look at what happens to them. And that is your judgment as a writer. Okay, so in the one case, one of the boys whose father insists that he become a doctor rather than an actor, ends up committing suicide because he suppressed his creativity. So what the writer is saying is you can't suppress creativity. It could backfire. On the other hand, unbounded creativity result in chaos, and some of the characters fear that. Then we have a character like John Keating, the teacher, who seems to appreciate tradition and some conformity to tradition as being a generator of meaning, but also allows creativity to come in. So perhaps the idea there is that one should have a dialectic between conformity and creativity. Anyway, so being aware of how to use theme, and Stanley D. Williams, who wrote a book called The Moral Premise, uses the moral premise pretty much like I've used the idea of the theme, by having a binary presentation. So in Macbeth, the moral premise would be, if you accept your role in your position in society and live your life out in the way that you have received it, you will receive acceptance and probably live to a, have a happy life. If you try to usurp the throne and become the King of Scotland, you will put Scotland on fire, murder the king, be haunted by visions of people that you have murdered, and lose your wife to suicide and end up dying yourself. So that's, again, a binary. If you do this, this happens. If you do that, what happens? And the ending tells us what the writer thinks. It doesn't have to be a universal truth, but it is the writer's truth. And it says that, yeah, this is what happens to Macbeth because he chose this path instead of accepting the kudos and laurels of just being a good thane in service of the king. So knowing how to use theme is part of the basket of nuts and bolts in stories. And there's a lot more. There's a lot more I can say. I mean, coordinating the character arc to the story arc and making sure that the character arc is slightly behind the hard knocks that are occurring in the world. Because if the hero learns something from each reversal or each hard knock, okay, if he gets ahead of those hard knocks, then he would not suffer the hard knocks, because a story is an excuse for showing the education of a human being. This is what happens when you do this. This is what happens when you do that. So the path to enlightenment is inexorably bound to the path of world achievement. Only those who are worthy, who have the skills and the moral presence, will succeed, will defeat the antagonist at the end, at the climactic point. Well, you've got to know that. And students have to be taught that. Now, the thing about, before I move on to the last one, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I do tend to rabbit on a bit. The thing about a theme is, some of my students say, well, I'll find the theme out. I'll discover it. I don't think about the theme. I just see the story play out in my head and I just write it. They're working at that outer level, okay, which is where a story should actually flourish, yes. But you've got to understand that outer level is predicated upon the inner journey. The outer journey is predicated upon the inner journey. And the inner journey, the knowledge to leading to self-realization, is slightly back on the challenges that the outer journey presents. Otherwise, the hero would win every conflict. The reason she doesn't win every conflict is because she or he doesn't have the knowledge yet. So life and the antagonist defeats him at every turn until enlightenment or realization comes. I call it the moment of epiphany, okay, when things synchronize, the inner journey and the outer journey synchronize. So again, you have to know about all of those things, and they're almost innumerable. That's the thing about writing. I believe writing is as worthy, in of course different ways, and as challenging as medicine, engineering. I think engineering structures the world, puts roofs over our heads, gets our cars to cross bridges. Medicine keeps us alive. But great writing administers to our souls, our psyches, however you want to see it. It helps critique our life and shed light on why it is that we want our bridges. Why is it that we want to heal ourselves? Why bother? If you look at the state of the universe, has been around for 13.5 billion years or what have you. I don't know what the latest count is. So, and our lives are just a sneeze. Why even bother? Well, I think writing gives us a story to lead our lives by. So I think it's very precious, and it's something that we will do for the rest of our lives. Even when we're 90, and frail, we will still be able to write, providing we have our wits about us. And then the last thing that I want to say, the third basket, where we should consciously be saying, okay, well, what can I improve today in this category, is the use of language. And I'm becoming more and more enamored of this use of language of late. The texture, what is on the page, okay? So what vocabulary do we use? Certain words resonate more than others. In Western writing, if we say, my name is Ishmael and I stem from Bethlehem, that resonance immediately brings us to biblical texts, for example. So any name resonates and associates and brings forth certain textures that are associated with certain great texts of the past. So we should be aware of the names of characters. The figures of speech that we use, are they appropriate to the genre, to the character, to the theme? So figure of speech, he was a mountain, she was a running brook. Okay, so we're using this kind of language. Is it appropriate to what we're doing? So, because every denotative object has several words that can represent it, and some of them are pretty similar, but they sound different. In English, we can say gut, or we can say stomach. Well, in actually reading that inside yourself, even if you're not reading it out loud, the texture of gut is more visceral. It's grittier. It has its roots in the Anglo-Saxon, whereas stomach is Greek, and it's a little bit more diffuse. So the actual sounds of words in our imaginary palette is important. That's part of the craft. Sentence structure. Do we have short sentences? Do we have long mellifluous sentences? And why? And how do they run into each other? Do we have maybe long and short? And so on. So that's at the level of the language. And before somebody decides to publish our novel, they're going to go to a bookshop. I've got here Steenbeck's Of Mice and Men and Cannery Row, or I've got Steenbeck's The Pearl, which I love, or William Golding, The Inheritors. They will turn, a potential reader will go to the bookshop, open a book, and read the first paragraph, and if he likes it, will read the first page. Well, before they can get to all our magical knowledge about structure and the spirit of the times, they've got to like what they're reading. It's got to grab them. Okay, so before they get to the meaning, they've got to pass through the gate of language. So concentrating on thinking about how we're going to render our story is a very important toolkit to acquire. So that's our third basket. Now, one very quick last thing, because I think I'm running out of time, but one last thing about, well, how does this contribute to the writer's voice? Well, every writer, once each writer has sort of delved quite deeply into these categories, and I call it the macro and micro. So if the spirit of the times is the macro, the use of language it's the granularity, it's the micro. So once we master that, we start to use it in a certain way. And that's also for the themes. You could be pursuing certain themes. It could be dark themes, light themes, whatever. I was going to say one thing, and I forgot to mention it, about theme. You have to think about the theme, because a theme will emerge at the end of your story, whether you intended or not. If you end your story in a certain way, that'll effervesce a theme. If a hero dies, you're saying something. If the hero wins, you're saying something. Because what the hero represents and what the antagonist represents, well, that carries the day depending on who wins. So you have to think about theme, because it'll emerge whether you're conscious of it or not. And it might not be what you wanted to say. A theme is what the writer wants to tell the world. Good guys, to be very simplistic, good guys finish first, good guys finish last. Good triumphs over evil, whatever. So you better be aware of what you're actually, how your story ends and what that is sending out into the world. So, and to wrap it up, in terms of the voice, you will start to use themes in a specific way. You will choose certain types of themes. You might be fascinated by technology, AI, which is all the rage, and God help us all. And you might use certain, write in certain genres and use certain language. So those will start to cleave out your identity as a writer, your voice as a writer. I mean, if you read some of the great writers of our time in any language, you could almost 80, 90%, who knows exactly, of the time identify who that writer is just by his or her voice. And that breaks down into the way this writer uses these components. So not only can we use these components to organize our growth pattern, realizing that, hey, if we're going to study history of humanity, that's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a certain amount of maturity to understand and sift through what it is that we're learning. But structure and nuts and bolts, we can actually acquire that knowledge. Okay, I offer new techniques, for example, on my YouTube every day, and there are hundreds of thousands of websites that do the same. And then the use of language for me is something that we can use to reel in that potential reader from the get-go, because that is what the reader is first exposed to. And if the reader doesn't like what you sound like on the page, sound inverted commas, they're not going to proceed to the next chapter. And they're not going to get to your wonderful messages and your wonderful characterization and character arcs and so on. So that's pretty much sort of a very fast, slightly haphazard run through what I think constitutes a writer's voice and how we can use these categories to organize our learning and to improve as writers. We never stop improving as writers, ever, ever, ever. So that's, I think that's it.
Oh, thank you, sir, for such a wonderful session. I'm very happy that I have learned many things from today's session. And the presentation, you had only one slide, and it was really nice that you explained all the nitty-gritties of writing a story in one particular slide. So that is really good. Now we'll take up questions of the participants. Some of the participants have posted their questions in the chat box. So the first question is by Deepa Reva, and he wants to ask you, do ethos enhance receptive or productive play?
Well, the ethos is the ethos is the invisible substratum of the texture of the world that you're creating. So there's the general ethos of the times, but you're going to have an ethos presented in your story. You're going to have a certain sort of belief system, and it's going to be imbibed by the characters. So the characters could be for technology, against technology, and that's going to slot into the theme. So every component here affects the action, another component, and affects every aspect of the writing craft. Because ethos is a framing device that you have garnered and you have isolated from your studies, and now your book itself is going to have an ethos. It's going to have a spirit that moves through it, okay, so to speak. So short answer is yes, everything affects everything else. And then, so for example, it will affect the genre that you're going to use. Okay, so the short answer is yes.
Okay, thank you, sir. Let's move on to the next question, which is asked by Vidisha. She says that, what is an advice that you would offer to students that are starting out in their career as professional writers?
So again, so when we say professional writers, we're talking about creative writing, hey? Because I mean, there's many to write. You can write for journals, you can have your own blog, and so on and so forth. But creativity, I found that, look, I've been fortunate with Amazon, okay, but there are other smaller publishers and other smaller vendors. But with with Amazon, you can write your story, make sure that it's going to do more good than harm. Don't put out bad stuff, unready stuff, if there was such a word. Publish it on Amazon, and you can also have Amazon, so you can have it electronically available, or you can have it, sort of printed out as somebody orders hard copy. And I would just start there. I would also form writers clubs, especially with the ease of the internet now, so that you can review each other's work. And I would, once I'm ready with the story, I'll publish it on Amazon. Because let's face it, with conventional sort of publishers, it can be a very, very daunting journey. I think everybody should have a go. But I mean, Stephen King apparently plastered his room with rejection slips before he got going. So nowadays we have that, and who knows, write something that just picks up on the vibe or is in synchronicity with the spirit of the times and picks up and runs, and then you're on your way. So for me, publishing on these platforms, and there's other Smashwords, there's all sorts of things, is a way to get your work out there while you're pursuing maybe traditional publishing and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, sir. Let's move on to a question which is posted by Dr. Meera Connor. Actually, she missed out the point on connotation and denotation. So she would like to know more about it.
So sorry, I missed that. Sorry, can you just repeat it? You're a little bit muffled, but it's okay. It's been like that from the beginning. Again, let me try to listen harder.
Yeah, it is. She missed out the point related to connotation and denotation.
Yes, must I say a bit more about that? Is that what she's asking? Where am I?
Actually, she wants to understand the difference between these two.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a very important thing, and I use that against the postmodernists quite effectively. So, as we all know, words are arbitrarily chosen sounds that have cleaved through tradition and have become language. But there is nothing inherent in the English word table that makes it closer to being table instead of being said blah, blah, blah. If everybody was saying blah, 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 that could be table. Okay. So nonetheless, we by social contract agree that table means something with 4 legs. Maybe you get a table with 3 legs, and that things sort of change. But denotation means the actual object as it exists in the world. Connotation means the poetic meaning that can flow from it. Okay, so if we say a sword can be described denotatively as metal with a handle, perhaps a jewel, and used for sort of slaying enemies or protecting yourself. Okay, that's the denotation. But the connotation is that we can say, but it is, it spills blood. It's caused sort of untold death and harm across the vistas of history for humanity. So the connotation of others might say, no, it's protected whole communities. So connotation we can argue about. It's the poetry that flows from an object, so to speak. The denotation is less arbitrary. We should all be able to agree that that is a chair, that is a table, that is a human. Okay. But what it is to be human, the connotative aspect, we have the annals of literature and poetry talking about what is a human in a connotative sense. So that's the difference.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We'll take 2 more questions. The next question is by Dr. V.C. Prakash. He wants to know that, is there any possibility to imagine that entire probable story by reading first chapter or few pages?
Is that written down somewhere so I can read it?
It's there after the question was posted at 5:20. Is there any possibility to imagine that entire probable story by reading first chapter or few pages? So he actually wants to know that can he imagine the entire story by reading first few pages?
I think it will give you the trajectory of where the story is going. I think it'll give you good writing. The first few pages will give you a sense of the tone, of the mood. And it also depends. You could intervene in narrative voice, although I don't often recommend that, and say, people are afraid to die. Well, I'm not. And not because I'm full of courage, but because I'm already dead. So if I start my story saying that, I've already given the gist of it away. The magic is going to come in how can this be true? What is going on? So the trick answer is yes. A few pages can contain that if you're being literal about it. Otherwise, in most cases, we get a sense of where the story is ending. But by definition, the twists and turns of a story. As I said, I've done a video on that. It's up now. It's the most recent video on YouTube. By definition, we shouldn't be able to foresee what's happening because stories have become so formulaic because they're so freely available, okay, that we now know all the tips and tricks that writers use. And we become bored with it. So in a way, I would say, unless you hook the reader with some clever sort of hook, like the one I've mentioned, I think we should just give them a sense of where to go and let them wonder what happens. I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but that's how I would answer it.
Thank you, sir. One question from my side. I have posted it in the chat box. What are the major difficulties faced by a short story writer while writing a story? What difficulties are faced by a writer?
Innumerable difficulties. Writing is, again, it depends how successful you are. But it's the three things. It's knowing something about who you are and who humanity is, even at some level. It's also choosing to write what you know. A lot of young people, they know their life, but they don't, they can't get on a chariot and fight the dragon. Well, neither could the writers, of Game of Thrones. Nobody's actually ever seen or fought a dragon. Denotation gets you there. Nobody's gone to Mars, but that doesn't stop people writing science fiction stories. But for a starting writer, I think write about what you write, because that will at least check that one box, the spirit and ethos of the times. You know what your spirit and ethos is. You want to do this, or you want to go there, but you get sick before then, or you're going to go on a first date, but you've developed this acne and you can't suddenly, and you might think, my goodness, this is so terrible. It's small, it's petty. Well, it's petty maybe to somebody, out there, but it's not petty to that youngster. And let me tell you, the smallest stories can have the biggest impact. Stories about a tiny little village in a place we've never heard of can have universal value. So write about what you know, learn about nuts and bolts. The challenge of the writer is to actually know story structure. And then knowing about the use of language. How language is beautiful. Depending on any language is beautiful. It's your paintbrush. You've got to cherish each word. I always say to my students, if you don't understand a word and you find yourself not going and looking it up, you're probably not intending to be a writer. And it's harsh, but you've got to love the language, love its sound, love its timbre, love its meter. So developing an interest in those things and then writing, sitting, like my channel says, get writing. Sometimes we can think too much. Get writing. I don't know if I've answered the question. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful guidance from your side. Before I hand over the guidance to Parul, madam.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much, sir. Thank you, Professor. Professor Halvatzis, that was wonderful hearing you. Wonderful way you handled the questions also. And the session was obviously very much enlightening for the learners. and the teachers as well. So it was wonderful. Thank you for the session. Now I have an information for our participants and everyone present here that ELTAI is organizing an international conference. Let me share the banner with you. We have that. Yeah. So that's the banner. You can take a click of it, or we'll be sharing with you soon the details as well. So it's 17th International and 53rd Annual Conference of ELTAI on Indian ELT, English for Global Citizenship, Multiple Teaching Acts and Learning Experiences. Dates are mentioned here. The details are here. I think you can see it on your screen. Okay. So I guess that was all from my side also. And we wish to hear Professor Stavros another time also.
Certainly, you let me know. Thank you very much then. I
So
really
is there
enjoyed
any other information? Thank you so much, sir. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much then. I'll see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye, sir. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Ma'am, you can share the next webinar poster to ma'am.
Yeah. So there is a next webinar also. I've shared the link. Kevin sir is also shared. I'm sharing the banner again with you, the poster. Please wait. Yeah. It's by Nicholas.